Hello my friends, my name is Rich and welcome to Greatest Rock and Metal. On Greatest Rock and Metal I talk about what are for me the greatest bands, albums, gigs of all time in rock and metal, based on listening to thousands of CDs and going to hundreds of gigs over many years. If you enjoy what you see today, please press the red button to subscribe to make sure you see future episodes of Greatest Rock and Metal. And today I feature the real pinnacle of Greatest Rock and Metal. Arguably the biggest band in metal. They have metal in their name and they are Metallica. Almost, one would argue, a household name now, after many years of bringing metal to the masses. Today I'm going to feature what is considered to be one of the greatest rock and metal albums of all time, Master of Puppets. But before I do that, a little bit of an introduction to me, my history with Metallica and Metallica themselves. My history goes way, way back, near to the beginning of the band. The band formed in 1981, and not long after that they released their first album, Kill 'Em All, down here. And it was the song Whiplash, which was the first Metallica song I ever heard, played on the legendary BBC Radio 1 Friday rock show. Now I had read about Metallica earlier than that in Kerrang magazine, UK magazine, very famous, used to be very good rock and metal magazine. Now it's more like a teen magazine. I don't subscribe to that anymore, sadly. And I'd read about Metallica. They had a real buzz in America and San Francisco, which is where they are from, where they were formed, I should say. And but I hadn't heard it until I heard Whiplash. And then when I heard Whiplash, wow, I was hooked. And from that day onwards, I have been a fan of Metallica. Like I say, they formed in 1981, not long after we had the Kill 'Em All album, that had been preceded by the legendary No Life Till Leather demo tape, which has since been released and is available out there on cassette and illegal downloads if you want to hunt that down. And it's basically faster, harder, thrashier versions of the songs that appeared on Kill 'Em All. Next came the album Ride the Lightning, a very, very different kind of album to Kill 'Em All. And here we started to see the things that for me started to make Metallica famous. They moved out of the thrash genre, of which they had been the great pioneers of, and now they, even though they were still thrashing, they introduced elements of classical music, prog music into their sound. But the thing that really put Metallica up another level, and it's the same with all bands really, is the quality of the songwriting. The songwriting really for Metallica has always been fantastic. James Hetfield, the rhythm guitarist and one of the lead songwriters, comes up with amazing riffs time after time, and that's why the Metallica discography is full of classic songs, great riffs, great melodies. And Ride the Lightning was a place where we really started to see those influences all come together. The thrash was still there, but we had classical, we had prog, and we had brilliant songwriting. And also they started to get into more complex lyrics as well, rather than the head-banging lyrics of Whiplash, which I still love, by the way. I'm a fan of all kinds of lyrics. Hell, I'm a Kiss fan. So I can hardly comment on anyone's lyrical ability when you're a Kiss fan. Anyway, moving on. So, 1986, their third album after Ride the Lightning was this one, Master of Puppets. Started to now take them to a new level, and it was very controversial. It's difficult to say that now when Metallica are so mainstream, but at the time it was very controversial when the thrash movement started to come up. And I remember a mate of mine, my best mate at that time, Stephen, and he was into rock and metal as well, but he couldn't get into thrash. The sound for him was a little bit too aggressive. And then with this album, Metallica really started to delve into some controversial areas in the lyrics. And we'll come on to that a little bit later. And it was part of the controversy, along with the great music and stories of great gigs that were passed around amongst the fans, that started to really get them some momentum behind them. And by 1988's And Justice for All album, the one down here, they had become an arena band. And since then, onwards and upwards. So, let's go back to the 1986 third studio album, Master of Puppets. It's brilliant. That's all that needs to be said about this album. And in fact, the two of them, these two here, are just two superb albums. Very different, in my opinion, to Metallica of today. And that's because they were still a lot more harder on these albums, and also the prog elements, which are still there in Metallica today, were a lot more refined. Now, whether that was down to the producer they used at the time, a guy called Flemming Rasmussen, I apologise if I've said that incorrectly, but as a producer, I'm guessing he had great influence on a very headstrong band. The two main characters in the band, as I've said, James Hetfield, the rhythm guitarist and vocalist, and drummer and founder really of Metallica, Lars Ulrich. They're two very, very headstrong characters, so it takes a strong producer to deal with them. But I have to say, having followed Metallica over the years, I think that Flemming must have done a great job in terms of making the song structures better here with the longer songs, because nowadays some of the longer songs just sound too long, but they never did on these albums. And when I talk about longer songs, well, the shortest song on here is about 5 minutes, and it's a song that starts off and is one of my favourite 4 from the album, the song Battery. It starts off with an acoustic guitar, classical kind of intro, before really thrashing out big time. California battery, battery, battery. Dun, 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 dun. Brilliant riff and full on metal thrash song. Superb in '86 and still superb today, and a superb way to start this album. Next up, my second pick for the favourite 4 will be the title track, Master of Puppets. A song about drug addiction, and a brilliant song, very long song. It's got a great breakdown section in the middle of it, before it goes into the Master, where the dreams that I've been after chant in the middle that always gets the crowd singing along live. Before we're into one of the amazing guitar solos from the lead guitarist in the band, Kirk Hammett. That leads us next on to, now this is where it gets tough. Okay, Those two are complete standout tracks on the albums, 1 and 2. But then the whole album is pretty much standout. And so it's very difficult to then choose another 2 out of the remaining 6. They're the 2 obvious ones. But the quality of this album is so great, it's a real tough choice. And if you ask me again in a month's time what my favourite 4 are, yes, it will still be Battery and Master of Puppets, but I might change my second 2. But as we stand today, my next choice would be Disposable Heroes. A real thick, heavy song. Again, another real fast, thrashy song, and about the perils of war and how all sadly the guys and girls who are sent to war are seen as being disposable by those upon high, in the opinion of Mr. James Hetfield. The final track I will choose is an instrumental track, a very long track, nearly 9 minutes long, titled Orion. And this track very much features the brilliant bass work of Cliff Burton, who was the bass player at the time in the band. And it's Cliff Burton who, it's said, had a real influence on the songwriting and especially the prog and classical elements within Metallica at this time. And Orion is a superb instrumental. Now, I'm not usually a fan of instrumentals, but this is just brilliant. There's so many ebbs and flows to it. It still has that thrash element there as well, and it's a fantastic song. So that's my favourite 4 from this album, and as you can see, there is the lineup at the time. We've got Cliff Burton, we've got Lars, we've got Kirk and James. Very young looking guys. Hey, this was many years ago. So, there you have it. That is my quick summary review of the brilliant Master of Puppets album. Next I'm going to talk about the Master of Puppets tour. But before I do that, let's take a look at Rock T-shirts by the Sea. Hope you enjoyed that. Okay, so we are now in September 1986 and the Master of Puppets tour has reached the United Kingdom. Massive excitement to see the band playing on this tour, supported by Anthrax. What a double bill! What an absolute double bill. 2 of the big 4 of thrash on the same bill at the real height of interest in the band in the UK. And what's quite interesting is that some people would argue that the UK was one of the first places that thrash really broke, along with Germany, and that it picked up far quicker in those 2 countries than it did in America in terms of fan interest initially. But that's debatable. But I think things like Kerrang! Magazine had a lot to do with that, because they were always on the money when it came to new bands and new styles of music. Whereas in the States, for example, the music magazines in the States were a little bit more behind, because their print runs meant that often they were 3 or 4 months behind in their stories, where Kerrang! Was a lot more up to date with its news stories and knowledge of new bands and promoting them. Anyway, enough about that. let's move on to this gig. It was the 17th of September at the Manchester Apollo, and this was my second time seeing Metallica. My first time had been when they played the Donington Rock Festival, Monsters of Rock Festival, in 1985 as a support, or one of the support to the headliners, ZZ Top. We'll talk about that another time. On to this gig. Like I said, great excitement. Anthrax really got the crowd going, and as always, you don't see bad Anthrax gigs. They're always great at getting a crowd reaction. And then Metallica come on. Now, one of the first things that we noticed, James Hetfield was not playing guitar. Why? Well, we later found out that he'd broken his arm in a skateboarding accident. Remember, we didn't have the internet in those days, so often we weren't that knowledgeable about what was going on with things. And there was a guy who we later found out, a guy who was called John Marshall, who was one of the roadies. I think he was the guitar tech for James. And he stood in on guitar, and so it was a very unique experience seeing James as a full frontman, no guitar, and moving about a lot more on stage, and quite an interesting thing to see him as a frontman in that way. Great performance by the band that evening. It's turned out for me that's been one of the legendary concerts that I've been lucky enough to see, and goes down in my rock and metal history as one of the great gigs. How can it not? Metallica and Anthrax, same gig, and one of the other historical elements to it, or two of the historical elements to it, one was the set list. Now, what was so great about the set list is that we got a nice even spread of songs across the three studio albums that they'd had at that time. So as a Metallica fan, you're covered on all bases. Whatever album you liked, you're going to get some representation from it, and it was pretty much equal representation. And they also threw in a full-length cover of their Diamond Head cover song that they do, Am I Evil? So a brilliant set list. That alone is historical in that respect. The sad historical nature of it is that just 7 gigs later after this gig, their bass player, Cliff Burton, sadly died in a tour bus crash. Luckily, the other members of the band and the crew that were on the bus survived, but sadly Cliff Burton did not. And even though Metallica have had great bass players as replacements, in terms of Jason Newsted, who replaced Cliff, and then in more recent times, although he's been there for 20 years now, 20 plus years maybe now, Robert Trujillo on bass. Again, sorry if I pronounced his name wrong. And there's something about Cliff Burton that's become legendary within Metallica, and I think a lot of it is to do with the fact that not only was he a great bass player and quite a character, it would appear, but also, as I mentioned earlier, the impact he had on the songwriting, certainly on the Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets albums. So, very lucky to have been at this gig. Like I say, one of my the best gigs I've seen, and it was great to see Metallica headlining venues of that size on their own, and of course today, wow, it's just in normal domes wherever they go, and incredible that the band has still been able to have such a successful career after all those years. What would I say are my favourite albums? I always leave you as well with my 4 favourite albums from the band. And I'm not going to talk about them much because for sure I'm going to be featuring Metallica albums again on future episodes. So my 4 favourites, well, it's got to be the first three. Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets. Those for me are just untouchable albums. And then I would also throw in the famous Black Album, because of course this is the album that has really took Metallica into the stratosphere and keeps them there today. The album continues to sell by the shed load, and that's certainly an album that I will feature in the future. Thank you very much for watching. Please press the red button to subscribe to see future episodes of Greatest Rock and Metal, and of course future episodes that will feature Metallica. And until next time, remember, as always, we rock!